A maintenance delay rarely appears in official wartime records. Mission reports list aircraft, targets, weather, and losses with remarkable precision, yet the long hours spent beneath an engine cowling are often reduced to a single line in a maintenance ledger. During the spring of 1944, at a Royal Air Force bomber station in eastern England, one delayed repair quietly altered the sequence of a routine operation. It did not involve a famous pilot or a celebrated commander. Instead, it centered on an experienced ground mechanic whose careful judgment, made under growing operational pressure, became part of a chain of events remembered only by those who worked on the flight line. By early 1944, Bomber Command had entered one of the busiest periods of the war. Allied planners were preparing for the invasion of Western Europe, and heavy bombers flew almost every night against rail junctions, factories, airfields, and transportation networks across occupied territory. Every operation demanded enormous coordination. Crews were briefed, fuel was loaded, bombs were armed, weather reports were studied, and aircraft were expected to leave the ground according to tightly organized schedules. Behind those departures stood hundreds of maintenance personnel whose work rarely appeared in official photographs. While aircrews rested after exhausting missions, mechanics often remained outside through the night repairing damaged aircraft. Engines arrived coated with oil, hydraulic systems leaked after combat damage, and propellers required careful inspection after flying through freezing weather or heavy anti-aircraft fire. Every returning bomber brought another list of problems that had to be solved before the next operation. Leading Aircraftman Thomas Mercer had spent years working on aircraft engines. His duties were routine but demanded patience. He inspected ignition systems, checked lubrication lines, examined worn bearings, replaced damaged components, and completed maintenance records that determined whether an aircraft could safely return to service. His work required precision rather than speed, although wartime conditions constantly pressured mechanics to accomplish both. Those pressures increased with every passing week. Aircraft losses reduced the number of bombers available for operations, while replacement parts sometimes arrived more slowly than commanders would have preferred. Every serviceable aircraft mattered. Engineering officers expected maintenance crews to return damaged bombers to operational condition as quickly as possible without ignoring safety regulations. One afternoon, shortly after another mission had begun, a heavy bomber returned unexpectedly. The aircraft had developed unstable oil pressure shortly after takeoff, forcing the pilot to abort before crossing the English coast. Such incidents were not uncommon. Instruments occasionally malfunctioned, but experienced mechanics understood that unusual oil pressure could also signal internal engine damage that might become catastrophic if ignored. Mercer met the aircraft as it rolled onto its dispersal point. Ground crew placed wheel chocks beneath the landing gear while the engines slowly wound down. The crew reported the fault before heading toward the debriefing room, leaving the maintenance team to determine whether the aircraft could fly again. The engine panels were removed, exposing the complex network of pipes, ignition harnesses, cylinders, and lubrication lines that filled the engine compartment. Mercer began with the simplest possibilities. Connections were inspected, external leaks were checked, and oil levels were confirmed. Nothing immediately explained the fluctuating readings reported by the crew. The inspection became more detailed. Oil samples were collected and carefully examined. Within the dark fluid, Mercer noticed tiny metallic particles reflecting beneath the workshop light. The fragments were small, but they suggested internal wear somewhere inside the engine. Wartime maintenance manuals treated such discoveries seriously. Even a small amount of metal contamination could indicate a bearing beginning to fail under the enormous stresses of prolonged bomber operations. Another mechanic joined the inspection while Mercer reviewed the maintenance history of the aircraft. Previous records showed that the same engine had accumulated many operational hours during recent weeks. Nothing indicated previous major failures, yet heavy operational use meant that wear accumulated quickly despite careful servicing. Replacing a damaged bearing was not a simple task. Access required partial disassembly of the engine, careful inspection of surrounding components, installation of replacement parts, fresh lubrication, and finally an extended ground run to confirm that oil pressure remained stable throughout the operating range. Completing that process properly would require several valuable hours. As daylight faded across the airfield, the engineering officer responsible for aircraft availability arrived to review the situation. Another bombing operation was already being prepared, and every bomber counted toward the strength of the next formation. Mercer explained what had been found and recommended continuing the repair instead of returning the aircraft to service immediately. The decision could not be postponed much longer. The next mission schedule was already taking shape, and every hour spent in maintenance narrowed the available options for the station's operations staff. By the time the engineering officer finished reviewing the inspection notes, the afternoon had given way to evening. Across the station, preparations for the next operation continued with practiced efficiency. Trucks carrying bombs moved slowly between storage areas and aircraft dispersals. Fuel bozers traveled from one bomber to another under carefully controlled procedures. In nearby briefing rooms, navigators updated charts while wireless operators checked communication equipment that would soon accompany another crew into occupied Europe. Every department worked according to a schedule that allowed little room for delay. Mercer returned his attention to the exposed engine. Wartime maintenance demanded patience even when time seemed unavailable. The damaged components had to be removed without introducing new faults. Each bolt was loosened in sequence, each housing inspected for signs of scoring or distortion, and every oil passage cleaned before replacement parts could be installed. Rushing the work risked creating a problem that would remain hidden until the aircraft was thousands of feet above the English Channel. Replacement bearings were brought from station stores. Like many wartime spare parts, they had already passed through several depots before reaching the airfield. Supply shortages were common, and engineering officers often monitored inventories as carefully as they monitored aircraft availability. Mercer examined the new components before installation, comparing them with the worn parts that had been removed. Only after confirming that their dimensions matched the required specifications did he begin reassembly. The work continued beneath portable lamps as daylight disappeared. Other mechanics moved between nearby aircraft, replacing damaged control cables, repairing hydraulic leaks, and patching holes left by anti-aircraft fragments. The flight line remained active long after the aircrews had gone to rest. While combat missions occupied only a few hours, maintenance often continued throughout the entire night. From time to time, the engineering officer returned to check progress. His questions remained practical rather than impatient. Could the engine be tested before dawn? Would additional parts be required? Was another mechanic needed to accelerate the work? Mercer answered each question honestly. The repair was progressing as expected, but the engine still required a complete ground run before anyone could declare it fit for operational service. That requirement reflected experience gained through years of wartime flying. A repaired engine might appear satisfactory while stationary yet reveal dangerous fluctuations once operating at full power. Oil pressure, cylinder temperature, vibration, and fuel delivery all had to remain stable through different power settings. Skipping those checks might save an hour on the ground but cost an aircraft in the air. Elsewhere on the station, operations staff faced a different problem. Another bomber scheduled for the upcoming mission developed an unrelated electrical fault during its final inspection. The defect could not be corrected before takeoff. With one aircraft still under repair and another unexpectedly unavailable, planners were forced to reorganize crew assignments. Such changes rarely attracted attention. Aircrews trained to fly whichever aircraft was allocated to them, provided it met operational requirements. Administrative clerks quietly amended movement sheets. New aircraft serial numbers were entered beside crew names. Maintenance records were updated. The process required little discussion because substitutions had become an accepted part of wartime operations. Every bomber station had experienced similar adjustments during periods of intense activity. Mercer knew nothing of those administrative changes. His responsibility ended with the condition of the engine before him. He concentrated on completing the final stages of assembly, tightening each fastener to specification before fresh oil was added to the system. Every inspection point was checked once more. Loose tools were removed from the engine bay, protective panels remained open, and the aircraft was prepared for testing. Just before sunrise, the engine ground run began. The propeller slowly turned before accelerating into a steady blur. Mechanics positioned themselves at safe observation points while the engine settled into its operating rhythm. Mercer watched the oil pressure gauge closely. The reading climbed steadily before stabilizing within the acceptable range. Temperatures rose gradually as expected. No unusual vibration appeared across the engine mounts. The throttle advanced through higher power settings. The engine responded smoothly. The test continued longer than necessary because Mercer wanted to observe every indication under sustained load. Previous experience had taught him that some faults appeared only after the engine reached full operating temperature. Minutes passed without any irregular behavior. Exhaust smoke remained normal, and oil pressure showed none of the fluctuations reported by the previous crew. Only after completing a final shutdown inspection did Mercer allow the engine panels to be secured. The maintenance documents returned to the workbench one final time. Every repair carried out during the night was entered into the station records in clear handwriting. Replacement parts were listed. Inspection procedures were noted. The successful engine run was recorded. Finally, Mercer signed the maintenance release certifying that, in his professional judgment, the aircraft was once again fit for operational service. By then, the previous night's bombing force had already departed without it. The repaired bomber was placed into the schedule for the next available operation instead. For the mechanics, the work moved on immediately. Another damaged aircraft had already arrived requiring attention, and new maintenance requests continued to accumulate as bombers returned from across occupied Europe. There was little opportunity to reflect on the aircraft that had just rejoined the operational roster. Later that day, operations staff received confirmation of the next target. Railway facilities supporting German troop movements in northern France had been selected for attack. Intelligence officers reviewed reconnaissance photographs while navigators calculated routes intended to reduce exposure to known anti-aircraft batteries. Weather forecasts predicted scattered cloud and moderate visibility, conditions considered acceptable for the operation despite the ever-present uncertainty of combat flying. As evening approached once more, the repaired bomber stood among the line of aircraft awaiting departure, outwardly no different from the others preparing for another mission across the channel. The airfield settled into its familiar rhythm as darkness approached. Ground crews moved methodically from one aircraft to the next, completing the final inspections that always preceded a bomber operation. Refueling had already been finished hours earlier. Bombs had been loaded beneath the wings and inside the bomb bay according to the mission orders. Armorers completed their final safety checks before stepping away, leaving only the maintenance teams to confirm that each aircraft remained mechanically ready for departure. Mercer walked once more around the bomber he had repaired. The inspection had become habit rather than formality. He checked for fresh oil leaks beneath the engines, examined the tires for signs of damage, confirmed that access panels were properly secured, and looked over the propeller blades in the fading light. Everything appeared exactly as it had after the successful ground run earlier that morning. There was no indication that the aircraft should remain on the ground. Inside the operations building, crews gathered for their briefing. Maps covered the walls while route markings stretched across occupied Europe toward the assigned target in northern France. Intelligence officers summarized recent enemy defenses. Weather officers described expected cloud cover and winds over the channel. Navigation officers reminded crews of landmarks that might still be visible if weather conditions changed during the return journey. The atmosphere remained professional rather than dramatic. By the spring of 1944, many bomber crews had experienced several operational flights. The procedures had become familiar, although never routine. Every mission carried uncertainty that could not be removed by careful planning alone. Outside, engines gradually came to life across the station. One after another, heavy bombers filled the evening air with the deep sound of radial engines warming before departure. Exhaust smoke drifted across the dispersal areas while mechanics watched for abnormal vibrations or fluid leaks during the final engine checks. Mercer remained beside the aircraft until the pilot completed the run-up and signaled that all engine readings were satisfactory. Only then did the ground crew remove the wheel chocks. The bomber began taxiing toward the perimeter track, joining a line of aircraft moving slowly toward the runway. From a distance, every aircraft looked nearly identical in the fading light. To the maintenance crews, however, each one carried its own history of repairs, inspections, and countless hours of careful work. Mercer stood with several other mechanics as the aircraft disappeared toward the active runway. Watching departures had become part of the routine. Few words were exchanged. The attention of the ground crews naturally followed each aircraft until it lifted into the night sky and merged with the growing stream of bombers heading toward the English coast. Within minutes, the station became noticeably quieter. The floodlights remained on around maintenance areas, but the aircraft dispersals stood largely empty. Mechanics gathered damaged tools, completed paperwork left unfinished during the day's repairs, and prepared workspaces for the aircraft expected to return many hours later. No one knew exactly what conditions the crews would encounter over occupied Europe. Despite detailed planning, operations often changed once aircraft crossed the coastline. Cloud could obscure landmarks. Navigation errors occasionally forced minor route adjustments. Anti-aircraft batteries might be heavier than expected around the target area. Enemy night fighters sometimes appeared where intelligence reports suggested little activity. Ground crews rarely received immediate information once aircraft disappeared beyond the horizon. Instead, they waited. Hours passed slowly. Shortly before dawn, the first returning bombers began appearing over the airfield. Their navigation lights emerged through the morning haze one by one before each aircraft lined up for landing. Some touched down smoothly, while others rolled to a stop bearing visible signs of the night's work.